Geachte rector, dames en heren, excellentie, I wonder why it took so long. The Ambassador's Lecture Series was initiated now more than 10 years ago, and only at this very moment we invited Frans van Daele as a speaker. It must be that we have been waiting for the perfect timing, and with the topic of today, transatlantic politics and diplomacy and how this is influenced by the presidential elections in the USA, timing hardly could be any better. We really are looking forward to the views on the consequences of the Trump-Biden election result next month. Of course, with Baron van Daele as speaker, timing would never be a real issue. It would be hard not to find an actual political, diplomatic topic where his insights would be not based on personal experience, like, for instance, finding a compromise in Belgian politics to form a government, or issues at the European level, like the Brexit negotiations. There's no time to list all functions, honors and appointments at this moment, but I do wish to mention as one of the important commitments and engagements of the speaker of today, as one of our alumni with a degree in Roman philology. He is still president of the Alumni Lovaniensis Association of our university. I would like to use this occasion to express my and our appreciation and gratitude that you've taken up this responsibility for such a long time and keep on doing this with your very typical style. I personally believe that representing more than or about 300,000 alumni of different disciplines and covering several generations, to do this representation adequately, it does require some diplomatic skills now and then. Frans van Daele started his impressive diplomatic and political career by joining the Belgian Foreign Service in 1971. And then I have noted a long list of commitments in Greece, Italy, the Belgian government, the EU several times in several occasions, NATO, the United Nations, and for sure I do forget a couple of them. Last but not least, at the end of his career, he became the diplomatic powerhouse behind European Council President Herman van Rompuy, as has been mentioned in headlines of newspapers. And also, he became Chief of Staff of His Majesty, the King of the Belgians. This has been an impressive career indeed, and you may, if you want to know more about that, you can read this book. We are living special times now. Nevertheless, we decided to move on with the Ambassador's Lecture Series and try to make the best out of it by using the advantage of live streaming and recording these lectures. Actually, by doing so, we can not only expose the insights of a speaker to the small audience of about 60 people locally, but we have more than 1,500 registered participants online. Members of the KU Leuven community, but also of the KU Leuven alumni community. Here in Leuven, somewhere in Flanders, but across the world, and I'm very happy that we managed to expose this Ambassador Lecture Series to this large group of people, and I'm convinced that this is going to be a model for many of our lectures in the future. So let me welcome you all on behalf of our rector in this room, all of you in and around Leuven, or wherever you may be. I do hope that technically everything will work out, and I'm really looking forward to the talk. But before giving the floor to our speaker, I invite Professor Bart Kermans, who will introduce the topic of today as our renowned USA expert. Professor Kermans is also chairing the Regional Committee on North America and in that capacity providing his advice, his expertise advice to the KU Leuven policy on the US and on Canada. Looking forward to both the introduction and the talk of later today. Thank you.
Dear Ambassador Baron van Daele, dear Rector, beste Luc. I would like to start with a quote from Herman van Rompuy, the first president of the European Council, to which the Vice Rector already referred. And he once wrote about Ambassador Frans Baron van Daele the following, and I quote, "He sees himself as a diplomat, not a politician. But every politician has to be a diplomat, and every diplomat is constantly thrown into political turmoil." It's basically my translation from French, but anyhow. And it sounds quite good, doesn't it? But anyhow, he sees himself as a diplomat, not a politician, but every politician has to be a diplomat, and every diplomat is constantly thrown into political turmoil. If you look at the career of Ambassador van Daele, the latter part of that statement may matter more for him than for most other diplomats. Frans van Daele has indeed served as diplomat in several top functions, like almost no other Belgian diplomat has ever done. Some call him even the shadow king of Belgium, even if, given the recent developments with respect to our new princess, Delphine, I am hesitant to use that term. These days, you just don't know what shadow king, queen, prince, princess exactly entails. And moreover, in the case of Ambassador van Daele, it's not a matter of DNA or paternity, but of an extremely sharp analytical mind combined with a richly developed intellectual background and a sense for the way in which the past feeds into the future, or rather in the present, and the present into the future. Is it a surprise, therefore, that again, in the words of Herman van Rompuy, in Belgium, there is no other person equal to the diplomat and the policy leader that Van Daele is? Or, to quote Van Rompuy directly, un prisonnier de la chose publique, a prisoner of the Commonwealth, who rightly has been granted the title of Minister of State. This prisonnier de la chose publique, this prisoner of the Commonwealth, is by no coincidence, in his own words, un Européen imperturbable, that belongs to a generation of leaders on the front stage, or like Van Daele likes to stress himself, on the backstage, that years before others understood that as the world was changing in a way that would make it more difficult for Europe to let its voice to be heard, European unification was a matter of survival, an issue of preserving our values while working to make this world, which currently is, according to Van Daele, and I agree with that, in the most serious turmoil since the Second World War, a better and a safer place. But behind these lofty ideas, there is a need for hard labor, for perseverance, and smart persistence. Sometimes, when all that one believes to be necessary needs to be fought for against all odds. And foreign ministers, prime ministers, a president of the European Council, and a king knew very well that within Belgian diplomacy, Ambassador van Daele was among those that stood out in this respect, whether it was as chief of the King's Cabinet, as Belgian permanent representative to the EU, NATO, the United Nations, Belgian ambassador in Greece, in Italy and Rome, where undoubtedly, given your interest in archaeology, it must have been fun every day, or in Washington, D.C. Let me quote from you, your work, with a reference to your book, Sur l'échiquier du pouvoir, in Dutch, Schaken met de Macht, which stresses more than the French title, the role that the diplomat and his or her talents has to play, and in the case of the ambassador has been playing, in the chess games of power inside Belgium, in the European Union, in NATO, in the United Nations, on a global scale, and between these different areas and levels. Referring to Jacques Brel in his book, you quote, Mr. Ambassador, the lyrics of Le Plat Pays, and I will quoting them more extensively here. Avec, in my best French, avec la mer du Nord pour dernier terrain vague, et des vagues de dunes pour arrêter les vagues, et de vagues rochers que les marées dépassent, et qui ont à jamais le cœur à marée basse, avec infiniment de brume à venir, avec le vent de l'Est, écoutez-le tenir, le plat pays qui est le mien. Isn't that why we invited you here, Mr. Ambassador? And why people continue to rely on your analysis, insights, and advice? You who represented and defended this plat pays in the world, who understood and understands how the destiny of that small, largely, but not exclusively, flat place will be determined by the strength of its wider economic, political, and security environment and the everyday challenges to preserve and rebuild that strength. You who helped shaping these waves of dunes to prepare us better for the waves coming from turbulent geopolitical seas. And you who, together with a generation of impressive front and backstage leaders, knew how to look through the ever-returning fogs, mists, and hazes, not in order to claim isolation, as one famous politician once did, but to detect opportunities and the ways to pursue them. These ever-coming fogs, mists, and hazes are there, as Brel had it, and they reflect the turbulent world of today, with the European Union exposed to an internal threat of a sclerosis of the values and principles on which it was built, with an overseas great power subject to unpredictability, behavioral volatility, even narcissism from its leaders, internal polarization, and regularly erupting urges of isolationism. And finally, with the shadow of a rapidly newly emerging power, vis-à-vis which we still have to fully define our place, our approach, and our strategies. And it is in this context that these US elections are taking place, with serious consequences for us, for Europe, and certainly for the world, and geopolitical developments in that world for the next 10 years. In such times of never-ending fogs, mists, and hazes, isn't it then not a surprise that we are more than happy and honored to give you the quintessential diplomat that was constantly thrown into political turmoil, this prisonnier de la chose publique, this prisoner of the Commonwealth? The floor?
Well, thank you, Rector, for your presence. Thank you, Vice Rector, for your introductory remarks, and Professor Germans for his eulogy, which was very much exaggerated, but nonetheless very pleasing. I see that on the screen that they call me a seasoned diplomat. That sounds a bit being pickled in a jar. But as we have now a government of 4 seasons, I don't take exception to the description. And whatever I'm going to tell you now is only in my own name and my own responsibility. American elections are seldom about foreign policy. It happened, for instance, to George W. Bush during his re-election, which was in the wake of 9/11, and military operations which followed. And then I remember being in Washington at the time that the election was then dominated by foreign policy issues. But generally, the outcome of American elections is, of course, very important to us and to the world, but they are hardly ever the central question of an American election. And these elections are not an exception to that rule. The present American elections are about a number of issues which are used to try and bring either people to come and vote, or are chosen to try and make inroads into the public of the opponent. I'll mention the obvious issues at stake. In the case of President Trump, he, of course, has been banging the drums of law and order, because he knows that may interest a part of the electorate which normally tends to go to vote for the Democrats. He has been very much prominent as far as lifestyle issues. That's the way they call them in America. It's what we call ethische aangelegenheden. Well, these lifestyle issues, abortion, transgender, etc., have come to the fore through the nomination, through the nomination of Amy Beckett as a successor to the deceased member of the Supreme Court. There is now a kind of a shadow battle in Washington going on right now on whether this proposal of the president is going to lead to a decision by the Senate in time for the elections, or whether, as the Democrats try to pretend, this should not happen before the elections. But it is and will remain a rather prominent subject, and it is a prominent subject which has consequences on the voting behavior of the American voters. So those are two issues which President Trump pushes to the front of the table. Vice President Biden puts a lot of weight on Obamacare. You know that without Obamacare, again, 20 million Americans lose sickness coverage. The Black Lives Matter are an important issue to fire his base, and then particularly the COVID-19 affair, which I think is becoming, in the process, is becoming more and more, will become more and more decisive to settle the outcome of the election. If you look, for instance, at the poll figures in Florida, you see that candidate Biden is way ahead of candidate Trump, and that has to do, presumably, a lot with the COVID crisis. Don't forget that Florida is a state with a lot of elderly voters who are particularly sensitive to the way the virus is handled or mishandled. So those issues are there, and they are used to good electoral advantage. The real issue in the election is, of course, the personality of President Trump. And one must say that he has been quite an expert in voicing the anti-elitism and anti-globalism which is present in a large segment of the American population. And he has given a voice when he was elected first, but as well during his time as president. He gave voice to anti-elitism and anti-globalism. I'm going to drain the swamp. I'll take on China. And that makes that basically a big part of his original electorate will stand behind him. But not everybody, because we see in the last polls that the trend the differential between Trump and Biden is increasing. The last poll which I saw yesterday on CNN was that they gave Biden 57% and Trump 41% of likely voters. So this seems to continue a tendency. And to conclude on the election, because I'll come to the foreign policy issues, one must hope that in the end, the outcome of the election on the 3rd of November, that it is clear-cut. If it is not clear-cut, then you will see that all the vagaries, all the idiosyncrasies, all the strangenesses of the American electoral system will come into play. I'm not, for the sake of time, I'm not going to delve too deep in that, but if the election is not clear-cut, then you may be sure that in a number of states, because the electoral procedures function through the states, that in a number of states there will be judicial contestation of the results. Fortunately, the calendar is quite strict. The date of the 20th of June for Inauguration Day is in the Constitution, if I'm not mistaken. So, just not going and delving into the details of American electoral law, if the result is not clear-cut, you will have a lot of contestation, and a lot of contestation which will be not easy to solve and which will show a number of weaknesses in the system, and which would give us a lot in Europe and in the rest of the world to wonder about. Now, I'm now moving to the real issue of today, which is foreign policy. I'm going to consider two hypotheses. First, Trump wins the election, and the other hypothesis is obviously what happens to foreign policy if Biden wins the election. If President Trump is re-elected, I think we have you can say that the withdrawal from traditional leadership, which has been a hallmark, that the withdrawal from traditional American leadership will continue. And if you allow me a footnote there, this phenomenon of withdrawal from its traditional leadership role started in '89, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Remember what President Bush, the father, said, we won the Cold War. You may remember this book of Francis Fukuyama, who called it the end of history. And from that moment onward, the Americans had a tendency to say, well, we have been carrying the can for too long, let somebody else do the job, and we go home. This is not a new phenomenon. I remember very vividly how difficult it was for us to involve President Clinton into the civil war in Yugoslavia. Then already the saying was, listen, this is not of any strategic interest to the United States anymore. Yugoslavia is breaking up, it's in your backyard, you Europeans should deal with it. And this withdrawal has continued, and it has taken two different versions, two different appearances. There is a Republican version and there's a Democrat version. The Republican version is mostly about withdrawing from multilateralism. American sovereignty cannot be shackled. I heard when I was posted in the United States so often the comparison with Gulliver and the Lilliputians to know how strongly they felt about being shackled imprisoned into multilateral systems. That was the Republican version. There was a Democrat version as well of withdrawal, is that the reticence against military exposure and military intervention was very strong on the democratic side for reasons which have to do with past experience, which have to do with the political background of many soldiers in uniform. But essentially, they have been always extremely reticent since '89 to expose themselves to war and to violence. The strange thing, or rather the interesting thing, is that President Trump combines the two. And never forget that President Trump has been a Democrat, a New York Democrat, for much longer than he has been a Republican. So he has a tendency to combine the two versions of withdrawal. Now, President Trump is somebody who understood very quickly that embodying this double withdrawal could be understood as a sign of weakness. And appearing to be weak is probably the last thing somebody like President Trump would ever cherish. So he tried to compensate for this double withdrawal in three ways. First of all, by speaking loudly, vocal and vociferous. Secondly, by being harsh, at least in the beginning, with his allies. Remember the spats, for instance, with Bundeskanzlerin Merkel. And thirdly, by picking very clearly a major enemy and calling him a strategic rival, being China. Now, here a footnote on China. It was a bit an obvious target for President Trump. In 2017, there was a shift in Chinese foreign policy. Before that, the Chinese felt, and President Xi said that China only had to bide its time, or China had to keep low profile. In 2017, the Chinese, for the first time, President Xi said, China has to move center stage, which is, of course, a completely different position from what they had, and which, in a way, made China an easier target for the Americans. Moreover, they have been building up their military and buying influence through the Road and Belt Initiative. But that was the third way President Trump tried to compensate for this double withdrawal, was picking an enemy. Now, I'm still in the hypothesis that President Trump is re-elected. What does that mean for Europe? In a way, the American administration, which is now in power in Washington, is quite content to leave us alone. They don't ask us much. They don't tell us much, and we are not really confronted by American pressure. There may have been somewhat in the beginning, but nowadays, in a way, they leave us alone. It represents something which I heard so often when living in the United States, when people told me, Europe, and they use a military expression. They say Europe is not an actor, it is a theater. And basically continuing with President Trump will mean that we will not be engaged by the Americans. They will leave us alone to our own devices, and maybe there are a lot of people who are not too unhappy about that. So that is my, in a nutshell, description of what may be the consequences of the re-election of President Trump. Now I move to the other side of the coin, which is Biden elected. What does that mean in terms of foreign policy? What does that mean for us? Maybe I should start saying that a number of issues, a number of questions will not change. And I mention the most important ones. The list is much longer. I could make a bucket list, but essentially there are three issues where Biden is not going to stray too far from the policies which are prevalent under the Trump administration. It's about China, it's about trade, it's about the Middle East, and maybe a bit about Latin America. In all his public utterances, Biden has been as severe for China as President Trump has been. He points as well to Chinese companies. He points as well to tariffs and technology restrictions. Biden was quite vocal on the Uyghurs and on what he called economic cheating on the part of China. Biden has said a couple of times that he will even increase pressure on China, and that to do that he very much counts on his good friends and allies, which means us. So whenever President Biden gets to it, he will confront us a bit and asking us to chip in, which is not an easy decision to take. So basically, the China policy, the policy towards China, will not change very much between President Trump and Vice President Biden. Trade policy is a second issue where President Biden will tend to be rather protective of US interests, of course within a multilateral framework. I'll come back to that. Trade policy resonates with what in the United States they call middle class, which is the blue-collar workers, which is the productive industry, and which they want to get back from as voters, particularly in the swing states, like Ohio, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. So it's an important issue which resonates with the segment of an electorate which traditionally voted for the Democrats, but may have partly voted for the Republicans the last time. Moreover, there is a constant pressure on the left-wing side of the Democrat Party, think of Sanders, think of Warren, which makes that trade is a very sensitive issue inside the Democratic Party. And what I tell you is illustrated quite vividly. There was a time when Biden said that he wanted to go back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had been jettisoned by President Trump. He had to change his position. He is now very critical of that Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you ask questions to Democrat friends about TTIP, the agreement which under the Obama administration had been negotiated with the Europeans, then the answer is, let's say, evasive. And those two questions, Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP agreement with Europe, prove to which extent trade is a sensitive issue and the positions of the Democrats are not far away from the positions of President Trump. There is a third issue on which I don't think you can expect a lot of change, is the Middle East. Vice President Biden said already that he is going to leave the American embassy in Jerusalem. You may remember that President Trump decided to transfer the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which had a highly symbolical impact. President Biden is not going to change that. He said, however, that he is going to reopen the American Consulate General in Jerusalem, which has always served as de facto as the American embassy to the Palestinians. So there is an adjustment, but basically he will leave the American embassy in Jerusalem. He even said lately that he approved the conclusion of two unexpected agreements between Israel and Dubai on the one hand and the Emirates on the other hand. He said that he thought that it was an excellent development. So you see this couple of examples prove that the policies, the policy line in Washington on the Middle East will not change very much, at least as far as Israel and the Sunni countries are concerned. I'll say something about Iran in a minute. So essentially, you see those are three main foreign policy issues where the shifts between Trump and Biden will be rather marginal. The essentials will remain what they are. Now, I am now coming to where is the foreign policy of a Biden administration going to be different from the Trump administration. And there are three points I wanted to mention. First is multilateralism. Two is talking to other people. And thirdly, it's about democracy, rule of law, and human rights. That's where you find the real differences. First of all, multilateralism. We are hearing over and over again that a Biden administration will again be much more favorable to the multilateral organization of world politics. And that will, under President Biden, appear in two fashions. First of all, he will return, and he said so, to the Paris agreements on climate, and that's a very important one. And he will return to the nuclear agreement with Iran, adding, for the footnotes, a condition saying that he will return to the Iran nuclear agreement at the condition that Iran itself does respect that agreement, because, you know, the Iranians have announced already a year ago that they would not abide by the rules of the Iran agreement because the Americans had left it. And the point of Biden is, I want to re-enter that agreement, but then the Iranians have to respect what was agreed under the Obama years. So that's one way, America returning to a number of multilateral agreements, and that's a good thing for us all. I think that there's a second aspect in multilateralism. The United States, under Biden, will try and to rebuild and reinforce the international system. I think the World Trade Organization, which doesn't work now because the Americans refuse to appoint new arbitrators in the trade panel. Well, I think that under Biden they are going to do so, and the WTO will be working again. I think that Biden is not going to leave the World Health Organization like President Trump decided. I think that the Americans may put a higher store on NATO. So you will see, not only is America going to return itself to specific multilateral agreements, climate, Iran, but it is going to be actively engaged in reinforcing the multilateral system. Now the corollary, and I'm coming to the second difference, the corollary of having a multilateral system is that you have to do what the Americans call talking the talk and walking the walk, which means that you have to speak to each other, and particularly in the mind of the people around Biden, this is in the first place, it's about speaking, talking, consultation and concertation with the Europeans. Transatlantic relations will be high on the agenda, higher, I think, than during the Obama years. But we must be aware of one point, is that this European kind of preeminence in the beginning of a Biden administration, this return to talking with the Europeans will only last if something comes back from that. And I'll speak in the end a bit about the conundrums and the conundrums we Europeans are going through after the Americans have re-engaged us. But it is a fact that Biden and his administration, if they are elected, will try to reconnect, but to re-engage as well with with European friends and allies. The third thing which will change, and again, there are many more specific subjects on which you can make the comparison, will it change, will it not change, but I'm only mentioning for the sake of time the most important ones. The third one where things will change is human rights, defense of democracy. I understand that the Biden administration is going to organize a summit of democracies, which is not a new idea. I heard that for the first time from Condi Rice. This idea of creating something where democratic countries could meet and exchange and build common opinion. I think that the Biden administration will be much stronger on human rights, where I think we Europeans and Americans will be then on the same line. I think a Biden administration is going to be much more strict on dealings or non-dealings with dictators, and there are a number around of them on which we can work together. All this comes together in, and let me finish there, or all this comes together in the transatlantic relations between America and the European Union. And we may be astonished. The United States, I told you that before and I repeat it here, as far as I understand what is happening, the United States will engage their allies, which is not that easy for us Europeans, because we are on a number of these issues, and I mentioned a couple of them, we are divided. If we are divided, like we are now, on, for instance, the relations with Russia, it didn't matter in the transatlantic relations for the simple reasons that the relations between Washington and Brussels were shallow at best. President Biden is going to engage us, and that will put us in front of our own mirrors. I may mention 3 structural deficiencies or historical deficiencies, which we always have had in our relationship, but which will come to the foreground now. They are there, they have been there in the past, but there are 3 conundrums, 3 deficiencies we will have to grapple with under a Biden administration. First, security, then trade, and then the big power play. Those are the 3 fields where the structural deficiencies and our own divisions will appear. First of all, security. We have an endless debate, a long-standing debate with the United States on burden sharing. It became very much to the fore under President Trump, but even under, I remember the time when I was ambassador in Washington, the times of George W. Bush, then again, it always came back, you, Europeans, are not doing enough. What I hope is that this time, with President Biden, we will succeed in broadening the debate, because it's so obvious to me that our European contribution to stability and security is not only about the money we are spending on armaments and on the military, but there are many other factors involved. Development cooperation is one, the fact that we have been integrating the Central European member states. All these are very precious contributions to security and stability. And what I hear from some of my connections in Washington is that there may be this time more openness, more willingness to listen to our argument, because this counter-argument, which we have been making over and over again, was never accepted in the United States. What I hear is that there now may be a window of opportunity to come at least to speaking terms with each other on what burden sharing means. And if we can progress on that one, that would be a big change for the better. This leaves, however, the question, even if we agree with the Americans to broaden the argument, they will continue insisting on us doing more in the narrow security military point of view. And we have to make them understand an argument which we have been making again and again, but which was never really accepted, the argument that the Europeans are only going to invest more in military security if they do it together. You cannot, in individual public opinions in Europe, it's very hard to explain why you need all this. If you explain that this is going to be part and parcel of European defense, you change the parameters of the discussion, and we have to make the Americans understand that. They, of course, they don't like what we call in our Chinese, the European caucusing in NATO. They are not too happy about the Europeans bandying together, which is the only way we can get a bigger bang for the buck, as they say over there. And that, there is a hesitation in the United States to accept that the Europeans do together more. Is there a subject on which we can create a new speaking arrangement with the Americans? I don't know. I heard it about my first point on a broader notion of burden sharing, on further diplomatic and military integration of the European Union. I think the jury in Washington is still out. So this is the first conundrum. If Biden engages us, if his administration engages us, well, all the old deficiencies, all the old difficulties, the conundrums, which are nothing new in themselves, will come to the foreground, and we have to prepare ourselves to know how we are going to handle that. And I think there are margins to be exploited. I think it's not a desperate affair to come to what I call a speaking arrangement on that subject. That's the first conundrum. The second conundrum is trade. I think that our bilateral in the sense of the European Union with the US, because trade, as you know, is a power which does not rest at the national level, but at the EU level. All bilateral relations trade relations will not be easy. I already mentioned the fact that when you bring up the TTIP question, that they try to skirt around it for the reasons I explained. I remember I was Sherpa of Van Rompuy when we had the first meetings on what became TTIP, the Transatlantic Investment and Trade Partnership. And even then, I remember my alter ego was Mike Froman, who then became US trade representative. There was, in the Obama administration, a lot of hesitation to go for TTIP. In the end, they did it. I think it was marvelous, because TTIP basically tries to create a huge internal market across the Atlantic Ocean. It was nearly there at the end of the Obama administration and jettisoned by Trump. We should try and work and to have more agreement on common standards and common norms. But I think it will be a very difficult negotiation if we try to restart it, and it will be difficult particularly because of the agricultural interests of the United States. So that's going to be a tough one if we ever try it. A second one is, I think, will be a tough issue. It's digital tax and data privacy. Digital tax is something which the major companies in that field, which Silicon Valley is going to resist. And although the four major Silicon Valley companies were summoned to Congress a number of months ago, I think that at the same time, they're trying to tax more the revenues of digital companies in Europe is a necessary development, because the way it happens now, it tends to diminish our tax base, but it will be not an easy subject to deal with. The same goes for data privacy. A couple of months ago, it was in the summer, I think, the European Court of Justice invalidated the so-called safety shield. What is the safety shield? That is basically an American system which implies the guarantee that data which are transferred from Europe to America will not be exploited otherwise than we would allow them to be exploited if they were in Europe. That's the safety shield. It has been invalidated because the European Court of Justice said to the Commission, you cannot put together this system because we are not convinced that if European data are stored in the United States, that the protection of privacy is the same or comparable to what we have in Europe, because we think that under the safety shield, the American administration can still go out fishing on a very broad base. And so the work has to be restarted. Data selling and buying is a huge business, but on our European side, we want to be sure that privacy is protected. And so this negotiation, which was very difficult, this one negotiation, which was then invalidated by the European Court of Justice, I think is going to give us a lot of joy. Third and last conundrum, is the big power play. It's about Russia, China, positioning yourself between Russia and China. And there again, there will be the call, the wake-up call from a Biden administration to say, well, we have to do something about these countries, and we have to do it together. And that's where it becomes tough, because our economic interests, with the Chinese, for instance, think about the German exports to China, or our interests with Russia, think about Nord Stream 2. All this is highly sensitive and highly political, and I can only tell you that in getting these transatlantic relations going again, which is necessary because only together we have the critical mass we need to make a significant contribution to the stability on this planet, but that getting our accounts right in this big power game of play will be very tough. So you see, and let me rest it there, that the election of a President Biden will certainly lead to a lot of attempts to revitalize the transatlantic relations. But revitalizing transatlantic relations means that the Europeans have to get their act together on a number of subjects on which they are deeply divided. So, as usual, you can't have your cake and eat it. Now, to conclude, how do you know, diplomacy is hardly ever about what you do next year. Generally, diplomacy is about what you do tomorrow. Timing is always the most important constraint on what you're doing. I think that in the shorter term, we have to concentrate on all the issues, on all the subjects, on all the matters on which we can find agreement or a speaking arrangement. This will have to happen within 1 year, because in 2 years' time you have midterm elections. All this will have to happen within 1.5 years, I think, because it's only if it yields results, an early harvest to the Americans, that this can continue. And for them, I think the cutoff date is the midterm elections. Now, we have to think, nevertheless, about the longer term. I think the difficult issues which I mentioned have to be settled as well, but it's only going to happen if we have a number of early harvest, low-hanging fruits arrangements in the short term, and then we can go afterwards to the more difficult issues. I think that I have respected the timing, which you always have has to do as a diplomat. Yes, Biden is the front runner, but the elections are still a month away. If he wins, it will be, yes, a positive for the Europeans, as long as the Europeans get their act together. Thank you.
Is it safe to remove my mask? You never know. You never know how infected I am, you know. But I like to remove my mask. It makes it easier for me to infect myself. So is Grete Keizer with us? Okay, great. I'm Bart Kermans, you know me. I would like to start my brief introduction of you by saying that you have great eyes. Yeah, you have great eyes. An American president once famously said when Grete Keizer was interviewing him. And let me briefly introduce her to you. Grete Keizer, who is joining us from Washington, D.C., where she lives already for quite some time. For the Belgians here in this room, introducing her is not really necessary. Grete is indeed a well-known face and voice in Belgian Flemish radio and television, with a career as US correspondent with the public television channel VRT for about 13 years, and after a brief interruption, also followed by the same role with the commercial television channel VTM for about 5 years now. One of the greatest assets that Grete Keizer grants Belgian viewers and listeners is her broad and deep knowledge, not just of American politics, but also of American society, thereby not falling into the trap of exclusively looking at the United States through a Belgian lens. For her, journalism is not a matter of sensation and depicting caricatures, but about reporting in a way that helps people to understand what happens and allows them to form their own opinion on the basis of that. It leads to a quality of reporting that we should cherish in a world of 24/7 headlines and deadlines. And I agree with George W. Bush and his claim that she has great eyes. Although I'm not sure what Obama's predecessor exactly wanted to get across, but for me, Grete's great eyes point to her knack for sharp observation, her eye for relevant detail, and her talent to translate what she sees, hears, and reads in high-quality, accessible reporting. It is with more than just pleasure and honor, therefore, that I give her the floor, or rather, the World Wide Web.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kermans, for this really nice introduction. Thank you, Rector and Vice Rector, and definitely Mr. Van Daele, Ambassador Van Daele, who I know and first met in Washington, D.C. Right after the 9/11 attacks, because then it was an important time for Belgians also to negotiate with the US, and Mr. Van Daele and I went through the same thing in the US, where we just really could feel how important those attacks were, and how really exhausted and angry and afraid the Americans were after that. Well. In the meantime, I live here now for 20 years, and when Mr. Trump was elected in 2016, I wasn't that surprised, because the Americans have had a really different acceptance of President Obama than the Europeans had, for example. In Europe, when I said that, President Obama was not the one that was really looking to the EU as his primary partner. No, and I totally agree with former Ambassador van Daele that, once the wall came down and once the Cold War was over, that strategic area that Europe was for the US, was not necessary anymore. That the enemy, was gone, and they could handle it themselves. And that is what we saw also during Obama, and what we definitely see during Trump. Trump was elected by people that thought that they were neglected by President Obama, because he always talked about human rights and minorities, and so that white male voter that felt neglected. So were those kind of voters, were they interested really in international politics? No, and you see that still right now. International politics are not on the top of the list for the electorate that is going to go to vote on November 3rd right now. So what is on their agenda is economy, and you might say like economy is very important and is linked to trade, is also an international matter, but the Americans think that every trade relation, every trade agreement should start in the US, and the other partners that might be involved in that agreement should be happy that they could have an agreement with the US. But that is as well for Democrats as for Republicans. President Trump went a lot further. He was not afraid just to abolish NAFTA, negotiated a new NAFTA agreement with Mexico and Canada. He will do that and will continue to do that. If he is re-elected, he will continue to do that. The European Union here in the US has a lot of, if you ask Americans about the EU, then they say like, well, you know what, they are so hopelessly divided that it's hard to work with them. And so they will side with and also with Trump on what they are saying is like, the Europeans can only ask the US to do a lot for them, but when the US asks them to do something for them in return, they come up with no answer because they are divided and they don't do anything. Which is not true, of course, but that is basically the image that Americans have here from the EU. So yes, Ambassador van Daele, I agree with you. If there will be a President Biden, it will be a big challenge. If Trump is reelected, he is gonna sideline the EU in whatever. He will probably add to his threats about tariffs and extra import tariffs for European products here in the US. That we will see coming. He says, like, for him, he sees it as a kind of punishment. He will continue on his ranting on, the 2% that every NATO member and definitely the Europeans have to pay into the NATO budget. Biden sees that in a slightly different way, but basically it's from the American is the most important. And you know what, we start from the American country and area. And then we see how all the rest fits into that. And I totally agree that it's very important, and that is important for a lot of Americans too, especially the ones that are now listening to Biden, is the reintroduction in the Paris environmental agreements. For a lot of Americans, they don't really know what it is about, but they think it's getting more and more important. For the moment, there is a hurricane again on the way to the southern parts of the US. California is still burning. A lot of wineries have been burned. their Oregon was burning. So Americans start to be very convinced about, how important all of that is. And you will see a Biden, for example, that will start talking about, for example, the International Court in The Hague. The Americans, and definitely Trump, is totally against it. He doesn't want to hear anything about it. But, those are all the things that are definitely in the possibilities when Biden is going to be president. But you know what? The chances are still, in my opinion, 50-50. Biden does really well in the polls. He's now almost 10% ahead of Trump. But you know what? We saw the same thing in 2016, and guess what? Still, Trump won the elections, and it's partly because of what the electoral system is here, but also what I see is that a lot of people are not agreeing with Trump anymore. And you know what? I will have to. You will see me on VTM in an hour explaining what Trump is doing right now with the debates and how he rants on about how he can survive, or how he did survive by miracle, by God's will, corona infection. But so that doesn't go well with the Americans. But are they enthusiastic about Biden? Not really. And that was the problem that Hillary Clinton had in the last weeks before the elections. It's the problem that Biden also has. But you know what? The way that the President Trump behaves right now is an advantage for the moment for the Biden campaign. But I don't want to bet my life on who it's going to be. And one thing I'm almost sure about is that on November 3rd, my evening for you, it will be November 4th already, is that we probably don't have a result yet, a definite result yet. And as always, you know, Ambassador van Daele was also in Washington in 2000 when there was recounts and recounts and recounts in Florida, and the Supreme Court finally had to decide about the elections. Well, maybe it's going to be the same. The only thing we know is that by January 20th of next year, and that's is in the Constitution, we will have a new president. So by this, I also, for the sake of time, I agree to give a lot of time also to Professor Kermans and the people that are following and listening to us the opportunity to ask questions. So please go ahead. Everything I couldn't touch because of the time constraints. Please ask them in questions. I can stay for another 20 minutes and then I have to run to the White House to do a live shot for VTM.
Is there anyone who wants to ask a question? I have one in mind, but I'm going to keep myself under control, which normally fails. But anyhow, yeah, okay. Did you hear the question, Greet?
No.
Okay, so the question that was being raised, you have to correct me in case I formulated it in the wrong way, but anyhow, the question that was being raised here was how do Europeans and Belgians deal with the uncertainty that exists due to the policies conducted by Donald Trump? That was your question, huh? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And policies, do you have a specific policy in mind?
You have a specific policy in mind? How can we deal with it? How can we look forward in the long run, basically, due to, given the fact that there is this uncertainty? Of course, that is something that is, okay, Greet, please do.
Yeah, well, you know what? There's one thing we know about President Trump. If he gets reelected, that uncertainty is going to stay there. You never know with the president. Even his Republican people in the Congress are sometimes confronted with, with what he comes up with. 2 days ago, he suddenly said, like, all the negotiations on the stimulus plan for the Republicans, they're off the table. Stop it. While the negotiations were still going on. Mnuchin was still talking to Nancy Pelosi, and suddenly the president said, like, okay, you stop in the middle of an election campaign. Yeah. So it's difficult for even for the Republicans. So it is difficult also for, across the Atlantic, and definitely as, let's say, as EU, as a unity of EU, like, how do you negotiate with someone that, it changes his views by the minute, like, and sometimes very unexplainable, because he feels so, because he thinks that that they do wrong to him, but so it is difficult. It's not only for international relations, it is really difficult. It's also difficult for the people who live here. And that is one of the things that is weighing right now on the elections, is that President Trump comes up with those unpredictable things as what you were seeing right now, and he just leaving the hospital, he now saying that that he is going to campaign again from next week on, while his doctors still didn't confirm that that he was healthy, that he wasn't a danger for anybody else anymore when he meets people, that he's not contagious anymore. So it is really difficult, and it's going to stay difficult. And as a diplomat, as a diplomat, also, like, as a Belgian diplomat in the US, you have to follow it up, like, day by day. A couple of weeks ago, Trump, or months ago already, Trump decided just to move his troops, his military, from Germany to Belgium because he's angry with Angela Merkel. Why Belgium is not paying into the NATO as he would like to, and still he's moving his military to Belgium. And you have so many examples. So, I understand your question, but it's going to be hard. And just by the way that it is unpredictable, that he is unpredictable, there's not a lot you can do to prepare you for what he's going to do next.
Any other question? Somebody else? Okay, please.
I was wondering if the position of the US in the world is weakened now. If you look at the Paris Accord, if the US wants to rejoin, they have to negotiate their way back in. Again, also the EU is more dependent on itself now, and they act on it. And how does that reflect to the role of the US in world politics?
Okay, the question was related to the fact that the EU. You heard the question?
Yeah, I heard it.
Okay, great. Yeah.
And well, under Trump, it's they don't. I think Trump doesn't care less. For example, in his politics against China, what Pompeo, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, State Department, he just returned from a mission where, they were talking about China with India, Australia, and Japan. So, they are building other relationships, away from the EU to handle their problems. Trump thinks that, the EU is, for example, handling Russia in a completely different way than what he would love to have that the EU does. So what he does is he just makes other alliances, and that, that traditional alliance with the EU that, was very strong, and with Europe was growing since World War II. Well, for him, he doesn't care less if the Europeans don't want to do what he wants them to do. He goes and looks somewhere else. He's making now alliances also with countries as in Latin America, as Brazil, for example, which he's trying with. Bolsonaro is someone that he really likes. He says he's a lot like Trump, but you see, he's just making other relationships and other alliances. With Biden, well, I think that Biden is gonna really first is prepared to look at the EU just to make an alliance. He said that he's gonna talk to the EU about Iran again. He's gonna talk about protection of the climate with EU again. But and as Ambassador van Daele said, multilateralism is very important for Biden, and EU will be part of that, definitely, but not the priority and not the only one.
Anybody else? I had a question, if I may, Greet, I also had a question. It's a very small question. You were referring to the fact that, and I agree with you, that voters in 2016 were not that enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton, and that we see this year more or less the same. Isn't there a difference, and I would like to hear your opinion on this, between Clinton and Biden, however, in the sense that there was in the United States also a lot of, I would say, psychological resistance against Clinton, a kind of a strong anti-Clinton feeling, which doesn't seem to be there, but I like to hear your opinion on this, of course, doesn't seem to be there as much with regard to Biden. Do you agree or disagree?
I do totally agree. That is very much true. There was a very negative view on the Clintons, not only Hillary, but the Clintons, as the ones that abused the system for their own gain. And lots of people thought so, that, that there was that they abused the system. So there was no trust in Hillary Clinton after America also, went through 8 years with her husband. But that is not the case with Biden. Biden is, in the eyes of the Americans, might be too weak, and too weak in the sentence of what the Trump campaign really, really tries to focus on is the very left-wing side of the Democratic Party. With Bernie Sanders, AOC, that is, they're afraid that Biden is going to be too weak to stand up to them. And socialism is something that, that is still not accepted by a majority of Americans, even by Democrats. And, Sanders called himself a socialist, AOC even more. But so there is a lot of doubt about Biden. He is, at his age as well, he will be, if he is elected, he will be 78 by January 20th, when he will be sworn into the presidency for the inauguration. But it's a lot of people vote against Trump, so that vision against Trump, and definitely, the part of the undecided voters is Professor Kermans. You know that very well. It's during every election. It's a very, very small part of the electorate. Well, I think that they, that they either, the ones that are not decided yet, will stay home because they're not very enthusiastic about Biden. They have too many doubts, and they don't want to vote for Trump. So I don't know, if you look at the numbers, there are still a couple of states. You know, if you look at Florida right now, there you had a return basically of Biden in the month of October. In September, Trump did really well in Florida. Now it's Biden again, and why? Because of the older voters, as Ambassador van Daele said during his lecture. So. There is not a lot of enthusiasm in the Biden campaign. It's maybe also because, you know, he campaigns Corona safe. He campaigns only for small groups. He doesn't want to go in front of thousands of people that might infect each other, that might increase the infections. So. Yeah, it's difficult to campaign this way. And now that Trump just announced that he is not going to accept a virtual debate next week, well, wait and see what happens.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, because you really put the emphasis also on turnout, and that is indeed a very important component in this story. Yeah? And it was also a problem that Hillary Clinton faced up to a certain extent, the lower turnout among minority groups. So that's a very important point. If people are not that enthusiastic about a candidate, there is a higher probability that people will just stay home or go to work, because the elections are taking place on a Tuesday.
Yeah. Well, the only thing that I see, let me add one more thing, because that is also very important, is that, and that might change my view, is that people they have in most of the states can go and vote early. They can go and vote by mail. They get the ballot sent to their houses and can just mail them in. Or they can go in person and vote during this month, so early voting days, earlier than November 3rd. And now the mail-in votes and early voting is incredibly strong. Almost 6 million people have voted already, and we are a month away of the election day.
Yeah, indeed, it's very important. Yeah, of course, it opens another question, not with early voting, but with voting by mail. Is then the disputes that eventually may emerge with respect to valid or invalid ballots. But it is indeed a very important point. Makes also, you know, phrasing a number of prognoses very difficult, because people are already voting now, and we don't know by what they are exactly affected. Anyhow, any other question? No? Okay. Did you want to ask her a question?
Good to see you after all these years. You haven't changed a bit. I'm talking of 20 years now. Just to add one strand of thought to the discussion we are having, I learned from Herman van Rompuy that mostly people don't vote in favor or for somebody, but many of them vote against somebody. And this may be a factor at play at what we are seeing now in the United States. But that's just a side remark. Good to see you.
Well, good to see. Well, I cannot see you. I don't see the venue where you're at. So that's a.
Or you can just say that I haven't changed in 20 years' time.
You sound really, really the same. That's true.
All righty. Well, in that case, we will move on to the questions that have been asked to the ambassador. By people that have been sending questions before the session today started. These people are following basically everything that happens here, so they joined your lecture. Is Grete Keizer, has she gone away? Oh, yeah, I forgot to thank her for... Okay, thanks a lot, Grete, for being among us. It was very unpolite of me not to thank you, and we really appreciate your input. Thanks a lot.
Well, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay, the first question that was raised was by Santiago de la Priscilla. And her question to you, Mr. Ambassador, was, I'm going to quote it, read it. Belgians are no strangers to having no government months after an election. However, this has never happened in the United States. If Trump lost or would lose his re-election bid, how much damage do you think he would do to the constitutional order when he refuses to accept the results of the election? And more importantly, do you see countries like Russia and China taking advantage of the fact that the United States will be in chaos and absent from the world stage for potentially months? So the first part of the question was the constitutional order, and then the second one, China.
But before that, on Belgium, in the 30s, the founder of the neoconservative movement has written a book which has remained a Bible of the neocons in the sense of small government. He said that, in his mind, the only country which could survive without a government was Belgium. In the 30s, he said. Since then, we have set out to prove him right. But now returning not to the resilience of Belgium, but to the resilience of the United States, I wouldn't be too worried, and I hear a number of scenarios which seem to be extraneous, and of course, if the result, the outcome of the election is not clear-cut, there will be process, proceedings, and procedure, as we have spoken about, but I don't think that extra constitutional things will happen, because the American institutional and constitutional system has deep roots, is very strong, has still a high reservoir of power and respectability. So I don't see untoward things happening without the institutions of the state reacting in the right way. And I hope with all of you that I'm right, but I'm pretty sure of what I'm saying.
I tend to agree with that. Not that that is itself important, but I tend to agree with that. Is there a question from the audience? Because we are going to switch a little bit between the questions that we got through the possibility for people to ask questions before that we came together today, and the questions that maybe arise here. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question to the ambassador? Nobody? Bart, yeah?
If I may.
You may.
Happy to. Mr. Ambassador, you were mentioning that you thought there was going to be quite some re-engagement if we ever have a President Biden with the European Union. What you didn't mention was Brexit. There's been a claim by Brexiteers that they would be the first to engage in new trade talks with the United States. How do you see that happen with a possible Biden administration?
Well, I'm talking about Brexit at least once a week, and I was so happy about this lecture because once it was about another issue. But the point is, people who think that they are just going to get a free ride in Washington, people who in London who think they will get a free ride in Washington are wrong. In my experience, trade negotiations bring the worst out of any human being and are always fought with knives and forks on the table and blood all over the place. So I don't think that the fact, moreover, you should not forget that at least the Democrats in the time of Obama, and I have all reasons to believe that it will be the same if Biden wins the election, disagree with Brexit because they think it's a weakening of Europe, and it implies that the European Union, France, Germany, and so on, are going to move away. They think that rightly or wrongly, but that's another question, that this will increase the distance between America and the European continent. So I don't think that, there will be special treatment in store for them.
And one of the things, if I may, one of the things that is very important for the Biden campaign, has been indicated by the Biden campaign, is the respect for the Good Friday agreements. It's very sensitive among the Democrats.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay. I'm going to ask the following question, if that is okay with you? Okay. It comes from Christiana Galani, if I pronounce it rightly. She's a student here. In the 4 years when Trump was president, China has emerged as a major power and is arguably through its actions in the South China Sea and military build-up, you already referred to that in your lecture, threatening to US foreign policy. President Trump has suggested, I have difficulty reading because of my mask and the impact on my glasses. Okay, President Trump has suggested Russia be readmitted back into the G7, that US-Russian relations improve, and has made efforts toward that, while he has followed a much more aggressive foreign policy toward China. If Vice President Biden is elected, do you think that Russian-American rapprochement will continue as a way to stop China and Russia coordinating in an anti-American policy? Or will Russian-American relations become sour again as they were after the Crimean War? She means the situation in Crimea, and subsequent sanctions.
Well, basically my crystal ball is not better than anybody else's, but still. The hypothesis the questioner is presenting basically would mean that we start with a kind of a big power game with unpredictable alliances and unpredictable outcomes. And that is the reason why I think the better option is a new rapprochement between the Europeans and the Americans, because that will then call the shots. Engaging in a power game where we stand between the Chinese and the Americans, where everybody tries to rope in the Russians, reminds me so much of the 19th century in Europe. That is, I mean, that's balance of power politics, but balance of power politics do have a sense, but they can go much more easily wrong than a multilateral kind of arrangement.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. And it's funny because she was referring to the Crimean War, and that was, of course, in the 19th century. A very good, in an ambivalent sense, of course, example of such a situation. Okay. Ruban Lapes-Tobal, if I pronounce it rightly, it's an MBA student. My questions, he wrote, are related to the economic field and stock markets. How do you think that the markets would react if Joe Biden wins the election? Your crystal ball is needed again. And then do you think that it could have a clear and important positive or negative impact in case that Joe Biden is elected? Okay, maybe the two questions are more or less the same, but anyhow, yeah.
Well, don't buy or sell on my advice. The only thing I really know something of is medieval French literature, and that is quite different from the American stock market. Still, what I know about stock markets is that they love certainty, and a newly elected president of a type which is not unknown, because, well, if Biden were to be re-elected, he would not present the unpredictability, he would present predictability. It's what he told, what his precedents are, and so on. So stock markets like predictability. Moreover, if you see now the battle which is raging in Washington about the stimulus package, you see that Democrats are willing to go even much further into injecting fiscal money, and that, of course, may have as well an effect on the stock market, and you'll figure out yourself which effect exactly. Thank you.
Okay, I was about to sell my, but anyhow, I'm not going to do it now. Okay, what was the next question? Unless there is somebody who wants to interfere here, people who are used to working in the stock market, that kind of stuff. No? Okay. Tamu Sutarwala, student in energy engineering. And the question is as follows. While the geopolitical relationships stay more or less the same every tenure, we have seen severe changes in the US energy outlook, climate change denial, clinging to coal, etc. How does an energy-conscious European Union and even countries like China and India deal with this? So with the fact that the United States is really sticking to, let's say, fossil fuel generated energy.
Well, the fossil fuel autonomy, which one day dominated the energy markets and which stems from the production from fracking in the United States, I think has been a temporary phenomenon. We all know that from a certain point onward, 2 years ago, the energy markets started shifting, and that a lot of investment in the United States in energy production, in fracking installations, became less rewarding. So I think what then happened may have been just a temporary evolution. If you now look, and again I take the hypothesis, which still has to be verified, of a Biden victory, there will be so much pressure inside the Democratic Party, and not only there, on the United States doing its utmost in the climate sector. And I think the American public is fired up, at least in the hurricane-prone states and in the bushfire states. The pressure will be strong, and you will deal with a new energy policy, I think, under the Biden administration, and I think the self-sufficiency of the United States will be much less of an objective. On the contrary, moving from fossil to renewables will be much more on the foreground. Again, that's what my crystal ball is saying.
My crystal ball is smaller than yours, but it indicates in the same direction. Okay, then a question from Julien Joux. And the question sounds as follows. Do you believe that voter suppression will be a major factor for the 2020 vote? Let me start with that question, and then for the 2020 elections. Voter suppression. Yeah.
Well, in '65, in the United States, they voted the Voters' Right Act, which was meant to stop all kinds of tricks of disenfranchisement, particularly in the southern states. And that worked. I mean, if I remember correctly, in the 60s, the number of African Americans voting in Mississippi went from 9% of their community to 56 or 65%, I forget now. So the Voting Rights Act had a huge effect. Now, the Voting Rights Act ended up a couple of years ago, in 17 or in 15, before the Supreme Court, and basically part of the Voting Rights Act was annulled or invalidated. So there is scope for different ways to try and influence the result. Voter suppression, as the questioner asked, which happens generally through the fact that in a number of states they ask for voters to show a photo ID. And I read somewhere in the New York Times a couple of days ago that 25% of the African Americans don't have a photo ID. There is something else which is happening in a number of states, because every state has its own rules and regulations. They look at the voting rolls, at the lists of the voters, and say, well, somebody who hasn't twice not voted, we throw him off. And then there are wild stories about ballot box stuffing. It is a fact that tampering with the vote in this very decentralized voting system, tampering with the vote is probably easier than it would be here. The American system always rested on the assumption of fair play. Now, that has not, fair play never happens 100%. So this may be a problem, and it may become a kind of an argument if the result is contested in some states. But that will only happen if there is no clear-cut winner. If there is a clear-cut winner, that's the end of the story.
Okay, then there is a question that maybe it's a very timely question because of the vice presidential debate that took place last night, which is about running mates. Can they act as possible game changers in an election? And particularly maybe this year because you have Kamala Harris and the age of Joe Biden.
Yeah, Kamala Harris is maybe a bit more of an important factor than usual vice presidential candidates is because, well, she's much younger. If Biden is elected, well, things may happen. I think she was quite skillful in the debate last night. And somebody said that, maybe it was Geert who said that the Trump camp tries to depict the Biden camp as socialists and left-wing radicals. And she was quite, I think, intelligently behaving very calmly, very rationally, and so you cannot pretend now that Kamala Harris is a crypto left-winger. And so in this sense, she did a good time. She is not going to make by herself candidate Biden win, but she could have made a bad appearance yesterday night, which she did not, and a bad appearance would have reflected on the chances of Vice President Biden.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. Then Bart Troch asked a question about the following. In your opinion, is a multi-party system more effective than a two-party system? We are again here with Belgium and then the whole
that's a tough one. Most of our Western democracies try to find middle ground between the two. Strict proportionality leads to difficulties in making a government. If you only give an advantage to the bigger party, which, by the way, happened for many years, still happening in the United Kingdom. I remember Mrs. Thatcher governing with a huge majority in the Commons, but actually only 30% of the popular vote. And so I think political wisdom is that you have to find the right cocktail mix between proportionality, which means total representativity, and on the other hand, the art to make sure that politics deliver a deal, deliver a result. Now the question whether this country or that country has found the right balance between the two is something which you have to discuss in every instance in particular, because every case is a bit different from the other.
All right, you went through the questions, I think. Yes, we did. And if nobody else has a question, I have one. Okay, yeah, first you. Did you hear the question? But my hearing is not good, so...
What is the impact on the research? What is the impact on universities?
In case Biden would be elected? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
The American universities are very unhappy about their the visa regulations, which made their recruitment very difficult. And foreign students are so important in a number of principal American universities, not only in terms of broadening the student base, but particularly in terms of income. And they are quite unhappy about that. I mean, everybody who's involved in this university and has contacts in the United States must have heard that story over and over again. We expect, in the case of a Biden victory, we think that a lot of these stumbling blocks will disappear. Generally, the growths of academe are quite favorable to Vice President Biden, and I'm sure that if he wins the election, that a lot of these constraints will be flexibilized, let's say.
Okay, I still have a question, maybe the last question, if I may. Okay, my question to you is, it's not a question about your personal preference or political convictions. That's not my question. My question is about something else. It's important that I say it in advance. Imagine that tomorrow, Sophie Wilmes, the new foreign minister, calls you and says, would you be prepared to go to Washington, D.C. again for a number of years to be ambassador over there? Would your decision, not on the basis of your political convictions, but just on the basis of your experience as a diplomat, as an ambassador, would your decision be affected? The probability that you would go, would that be affected by the election of either Biden or Trump?
The probability that they would ask me so is probably quite low. Like any criminal, the best way to follow is not to return to the place of the deed. But in my decision, if decision were to be taken, which will not be the case, I mean, having Biden or Trump wouldn't make a difference, because both cases would be quite enjoyable for the political operator I have been educated to be.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Dat was heel fijn. Bedankt. Let me conclude just by saying thanks a lot to many people, to the audience, of course, here, the people that have been following this through the internet. Of course, the ambassador, Grete Keizer, the vice rector, who played a very central role in organizing this, the practical issues related to that, including Bart Hendricks for organizing this, and I hope you really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Good evening.